Okay, everyone. We'll get started in maybe like a minute or so. I just wanted to just note a couple of things before we get started, and that we're going to be spotlighting speakers, and I feel like I'm spotlighted right now, so I'm taking up your screen. But if you don't want to just see me and you want to see all the wonderful people here, you can press the gallery button at the top of your top right corner of your screen under view, and you can look at gallery, and then you can get everyone's face in there. And as people are arriving in the next couple of minutes here, feel free to use the chat during the presentation today to connect with one another. I feel like the Dialogues has been a great space to do that, and we've already been connecting, so feel free to continue to do that in the chat. And also, we are recording the presentation today, as you would have just heard, so feel free to turn off your camera if you don't want to be on part of the recording, if you want to be private. I guess I can get started. It's 1 o'clock right now. I feel like people are going to probably keep trickling in. But hello, everyone, and welcome to the final Paueru Gai Dialogues series conversation. I believe final for now anyways, Monumental Reckoning, an amazing title. So thank you so much for being with us here today, and wherever you are, I hope you are keeping safe and finding the support you need in what feels like a period of relentless crisis, a crisis that many have been feeling for much longer than I have. But I'm grateful to be in this space with you in the midst of it all. So my name is Nicole Yakashiro. I sit on the Powell Street Festival's Advocacy and Outreach Committee, and I'm going to be your housekeeper for today. I'm speaking to you from the ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in what is also called East Vancouver. And this is also where Powell Street Festival operates from during the festival season and throughout the year. As a settler of German, Russian, and Japanese descent, I gain much from this land, and I also take it for granted. And this is something I'm actively working on changing. At times, these land acknowledgements can seem really empty, but I want to suggest that this acknowledgement, as inadequate as it is, serves as just an entry point to a bigger conversation about occupying stolen land. What does it mean to do so? How can settlers and the Japanese Canadian community come to be here in ways that are responsible to both the land and Indigenous peoples we have come to displace and dispossess by our very presence here? And what might the politics of memorialization and monuments have to do with this? And what might it have to do with, for example, what's happening right now in Wet'suwet'en? I want to suggest that today's conversation is one way we might begin to grapple with these questions. In addition to my work with Powell Street Festival, I am also a PhD student in history at UBC on the path to becoming a historian, which still feels weird to say. So the topic of today, the role of memorialization and the ongoing debates over the relationship between history and monuments, is in my mind vital. Monuments are not history per se, but they do make historical arguments about what and who matters and what and who do not matter. And in doing so, they deserve our attention. Remembering and its twin forgetting, particularly in the public realm, are never innocent or benign acts. They are political and they impact different communities in different ways. Memorialization too has its own history. Monuments are erected and places are named within specific times and places. The good thing about this is that our context is always changing, which means we have the ability to change what we want to memorialize and how we do so too. For the past several years, I have become especially concerned with how the history of Japanese Canadians is remembered and mobilized. How has the community commemorated its past and at what cost? Who is included in these commemorations and who is excluded? How do these commemorations happen? What kind of behavior do they valorize and what kind of actions are forgotten? Who might our commemorations obscure? How might we find new ways of commemorating the Japanese Canadian pasts that do better to underscore Indigenous peoples' ongoing struggle against colonialism, for example, or that support other communities facing their own forms of violence, such as the Downtown Eastside community or the trans community on this day of transgender remembrance? These are just some of the questions I'm asking myself as we enter today's dialogue. And I encourage you to ask your own and to take seriously the impacts of remembering and forgetting today. And we are really lucky to have such wonderful speakers to speak to these topics from really diverse backgrounds. Before I introduce our wonderful host, I just want to go over a few more practical housekeeping notes and thank yous. So firstly, this series is made possible because of the financial support from the HAPA Collaborative, SFU's David Lamb Center, the Canada Council for the Arts, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and many individual donors and in-kind support from the Bulletin Magazine and Element IQ. Just wanted to note again that this is being recorded and these recordings will be available on Powell Street Festival's YouTube channel. Again, you can turn off your camera if you wish to remain private. Again, you can use the chat box throughout the talk. There will be a Q&A right after the panelists' presentations. So feel free to write questions in the chat box and we'll keep track of those. And we also have the breakout group section, and our priority is always to make sure that everyone feels open to talk and share with each other in those breakout rooms. So I encourage you to do so. Because of time constraints, facilitators might have to cut things off and conversations off a little bit during the breakout rooms, but I hope you continue those conversations either through online means or by email or something like that. And as participants, we ask that you be active and generous listeners and to value everyone's perspective in those conversations. So again, if you want to continue the conversation, there's going to be a discussion page on Facebook. And just a small conflict of interest that we wanted to highlight. Our panelist, Joe Fry, is the principal owner of the HAPA Collaborative, a major sponsor of the series. Joe is a longtime member of the Powell Street Festival family and is bringing expertise and an important perspective to the topic, but we just wanted to flag that for everyone. Okay, I think that's all from me. So we are grateful to have Kelty Miyoshi McKinnon to host today's conversation. Kelty McKinnon is a landscape architect and partner at PFS Studio, especially in projects dealing with the public realm. She is committed to the creation of meaningful public spaces that merge cultural, social, and environmental ecologies. So welcome, Kelty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Welcome all to the 9th Paueru Gai Dialogue. Thank you to Powell Street Festival gang, specifically the organizers of the festival, Emiko, Sammy, Dustin, Nicole, and Gawa, for making this happen. And to today's esteemed guests, Ken Lum, Skundaal, Bernie Williams, and Joe Fry. Thank you for being here and contributing to the conversation. So I'm grateful to be zooming in today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, on whose lands I live, work, and play. So I'm Yonsei, 4th generation Japanese Canadian. My great grandparents on my mother's side came from farming country in Fukuoka, Japan. My great grandfather Katsube Fukami by way of the sugarcane plantations in Hawaii to the coastal rainforest and then strawberry fields of Mission, BC, situated on the unceded territory of the Stolo people. And my great grandmother Asa Fukami came soon after as a picture bride. On my dad's side, my great grandparents came as settlers from Scotland, Germany, and England to the traditional territories of the Cote First Nation at Togo, a rural Saskatchewan town of 86, interestingly named after a Japanese admiral, Togo, of the 1906 Russo-Japanese War. The naming of today's conversation is called Monumental Reckoning, though we grappled with several possible shufflings of the name, each of which raised different questions. Monuments and reckoning, reckoning and monuments, reckoning with monuments, monumental reckoning. We ended up picking that one. Naming the event took some time and conversation, and through that process, we came up with many questions. We have, over the past number of years, seen or been involved in a number of direct confrontations with what role monuments play within our public spaces, several locally and internationally. So I'll bring up the slides now. Share my screen. Can you all see that? Great. Yeah, so there's the front page. Let's see here. There we go. So as a landscape architect, I was raised on a diet of interesting education. I studied in the 90s in Manitoba and Minnesota and was raised on such texts as modernist and postmodernist textbooks, such as Sir Geoffrey and Susan Jellicoe's The Landscape of Man, Bauhaus modernist Siegfried Gideon's Space, Time and Architecture, and Jansson's History of Art. These texts emphasize the landscapes of power: French formal gardens, the gardens and spaces of nobility, queens and kings, generals and knights, presidents and prime ministers. The opening to Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe's Landscape of Man is called Landscape and Civilization, and states man's destiny to rise above the animal state. He creates around him an environment that is a projection into nature of his abstract ideas, the mind of intellectual man. So, these statements are super problematic and express worldviews on what is important, what holds collective value, and how those values are made manifest in physical form. So about monuments, what is a monument? There's a million different ways to think about that word, but according to the dictionary, a monument is a type of structure that was explicitly created to commemorate a person or event, or which has become relevant to a social group as part of their remembrance of historic times or cultural heritage due to its artistic, historic, political, technical, or architectural importance. Here we have Captain Vancouver and Lord Stanley. The inscription on Lord Stanley's plinth is "To the use and enjoyment of the park for all people, of all customs and creeds for all times. I name thee Stanley Park." 1889. The word monument evokes images of greatness, in quotes. Captain George Vancouver in front of City Hall, or Lord Stanley in front of Stanley Park, stress narratives of power, of their ideal of democracy, greatness, generosity. Like most Western monuments to greatness, the materials express permanence: marble, granite, bronze, and steel. And the relationship of man, because it is most often a man, and a white one at that, to earth is one of transcendence, not of the earth and of our communities, but aspiring to the heavens, separate and above, large in scale, most certainly larger than you or I, and looking outward above and over our heads. Their stance and gesture is importance, standing tall, maybe even on a horse or sitting on a throne. They command and express so-called eternal truths. But whose truths do they tell, and whose stories are ignored, glossed over, or erased? Monuments often symbolize deeply ingrained power structures and ideologies. Indeed, a monument takes up space, often modeled on the traditions of landscapes of kings and queens, of palaces and great houses. Here we are at the Washington Monument, modeled on the landscape designs of the French formal garden. The landscape of Versailles, its large sightline axes, its expression of total power extending into the landscape. It's often the reason why iconoclastic sentiments arise and when discussing these contested sites. Who controls these narratives? How do we reconcile our present values with outmoded historical beliefs and moralities that no longer hold truth for us today? Who is we? This is not a sort of a linear narrative, but this was a really amazing project for me when I was in university. This is a sketch of the Vietnam War Memorial. This is a competition entry by Maya Lin. It was the first memorial to really disrupt that idea of monument. And I think as a landscape architect, what's really interesting about it is that it is more a cut within the landscape. It's a depression rather than on a plinth. It's of the earth. It's extensive. We make our way through it. It's a choreographed experience. She was very young. She was a Vietnamese American. She won this competition. It was quite amazing. It was a blind competition, so nobody knew who it was who submitted that idea. But it was built. And this really was a game changer for monuments at the time. You can see that the experience of going under the earth, the materials, even though they are still very much marble and those materials of permanence, are reflective and evocative and emotional. So it became more of an experience of a personal experience of emotional connection to the dead. You could touch the names. You were encouraged to touch the names, and it was sort of a trajectory that you walked along. So that was quite interesting. The other thing, and I won't talk for much longer, but when I was thinking about this, I was interested in, when I lived in Japan, I was interested in this idea of monument as something a little bit different. And when I started to look up, monuments in Japan, the Japanese word for monument is kinenbutsu, a collective term used to designate cultural heritage or importance, and comes in three categories. It's designated, so historic sites, which are similar in how they're thought of to here, shiseki, places of scenic beauty, meisho, and natural monuments, or tenen kinenbutsu. A monument can be designated based on multiple criteria. For the historic sites and special cultural sites, it is things like shell mounds, settlement ruins, battlefields, and other historic ruins of historical significance. The second category, places of great beauty, familiarity of a viewpoint, mountains, valleys, and caves, but also springs, sand dunes, wetlands, places inhabited by a particular insect or bird, places of dense growth, and even particular colors, autumnal colors. And then it gets stranger and more interesting when we move into the idea of natural monuments and how they're designated. One of the categories is peculiar and unpeculiar animals, plants, vegetation, historic trees, a deformed tree, a cluster of wasteland plants, rare water plants, indeed algae, moss, and even microbes can be monuments, epiphytic plants, conformable and unconformable strata, folds and thrusts of geology, the sediment of onsen, ice and frost phenomena, and erosion. So the first image was a monument from Lake Akan in Hokkaido, a seaweed cone. The second is a breeding ground for the Melissa Arctic bird. And these lists made me think of the poetic lists of the Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon, a genre-bending writer from long ago whose unusual juxtapositions make us think of the elements of everyday life in new and inventive ways. So like the unconformable strata of the Tenen Kinenbutsu, Japan's designated monuments, how might the everyday erased and or historically denied push up, fold, and thrust into our public narratives to represent and take up space once again? How can we rethink and reimagine what monument means and why memorialization might be important? Do we need monuments? And if so, why? What do they mean and for whom? Who is making the monument? Who participates in that making? How are monuments being rethought? Each of our three presenters today speak to these ideas, and whether they call their work monument or not, I think there's a lot of very interesting food for thought in their work. So please listen closely to their words, write down questions that you might have for the breakout groups. And very excited to introduce our first panelist is Ken Lum. And he just emailed me telling me to shorten his bio, but I'm not going to, Ken, because it's very, very interesting. So I had the pleasure of sitting on the board of directors of Centre Vancouver's International Center for Contemporary Art long ago with Ken in the 2000s, and very excited that he's part of our discussion today. As we all know, most of us know, Ken is an artist born and raised in Vancouver. He works in various media and is concerned with issues of identity and acculturation as represented in photography and the urban scape. He has shown his work extensively, both locally and internationally, such as the Canadian Museum of Contemporary Photography, Center for Contemporary Art in Kita, Japan, the Gate Foundation, not the Gates Foundation in Amsterdam, as well as the Sao Paulo Biennale, Venice Biennale, Johannesburg Biennale, And you can find Ken's public artwork all over the world, but locally, many of you will likely have seen his works, such as the Four Boats Stranded, red and yellow, black and white, on top of the Vancouver Art Gallery, A Tale of Two Children, a work for Strathcona, one of my favorite pieces, and of course the landmark monument for East Vancouver. So from 2000 to 2006, Ken Lum was head of the grad program in studio art at UBC, and he is currently professor in the School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He is co-curator of the Monument Lab, a public art and history project, which hopefully he'll speak a little bit about today, a citywide public art exhibition in Philadelphia. The exhibition dealt with the ways in which space is engaged in terms of a city's monumental landscape. The aim of Monument Lab is to better understand the mechanisms of a memorialization by questioning the status of the monument in the context of its canonical disposition. Welcome, Ken.
Oh, thanks very much, Kelty. Well, since I'm in Midtown Manhattan, I should also do a brief land acknowledgement that I'm sitting here in Manhattan, and Manhattan, unlike the the mythic narrative of trading beads for the island of Manhattan, was violently wrested from the Lenape people through a whole endless series that took several hundred years, actually, of taking away the land by violent settlement. So anyways, let me just start with Monument Lab, because it's morphed into more of a think tank today. It's arguably one of the leading think tanks precisely on the topic of the performance and operations of monuments. And we have about almost 30 people working for Monument Land. It started in my office in 2012 as an idea, but with Paul Farber, another University of Pennsylvania teacher. And it started because I walked around the city of Philadelphia, which was new to me at the time in 2012. Philadelphia is, by North American standards, a very old city. It was founded about 1648. And there's over 1,000 statues in the city of Philadelphia. But only 2 are of historical women, not counting muses and angels and so on. And none were of African Americans, despite the fact that there's a very long and proud history of African American contributors to Philadelphia. And it wasn't until 2017 that you had the first officially full-figured sanctioning of a statue to Octavius Cato, who was a 19th century civil rights activist and voting rights activist, and so on. So, and moreover, there was all kinds of absurdities that I know, which is that there was for a very long time, a statue of Rocky Balboa from the Rocky movies, a fictitious white boxer, which was at that time put atop the symbolic stairs of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is a kind of iconic site of the city. And yet there was no statue of Joe Frazier, who beat Muhammad Ali in a world heavyweight championship fight. So a black boxer from Philadelphia was not memorialized, and yet Rocky Balboa was, right? And then I also happened to live very near the childhood home of Billie Holiday, and I discovered that aside from the marker in front of her home, there was no statue of Billie Holiday. But there's many statues of all kinds of white businessmen who's, I guess, had contributed to the economy of the city, but to this, you would have to do research to try to retrieve what they actually did, because they're not historically significant figures. And so this kind of unevenness in terms of the monumental landscape of any kind of social terrain really kind of interested me. I think one of the problems in terms of monuments is that the solutions seem readily simple. We just take down some egregious monuments, or we put up monuments as counter monuments to the monuments, and so on. But I actually think that's a very quick, short-handed response that may be contributive, but I actually don't think that it's significantly meaningful unless we ask ourselves the question of what do memorials and monuments, what do they actually do? And to whom are they meant to help? I think that's a very important question. Kelty kind of reframed it slightly differently. Is it meant to repair social problems? Is it meant to promote a kind of social recovery from conflict of the past, or ongoing conflict, or of ongoing or past traumas? Is that what it's supposed to do, right? And I think, in my view, the answer is clear. Yes, it should do that, but it can't do that on its own. It needs to can only perform that effectively if there's also a commensurate, honest accounting of history in all its complexity. And I think, and that includes pedagogical programs in schools, and extending the heeding of the unheeded. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of local knowledge by seniors, by children, at a very local level, by the impoverished, by the othered, within any kind of social environment, and generally they are not heeded. Michel Foucault called them, subjugated knowledges, meaning that they were knowledges that had value and even salient value, but that they were not officially valued because they were never recorded. They were never part of official knowledge. They were never part of credentialed knowledge and such. And so I think we really need to kind of expand in a very most democratic and genuine sense the inclusion of the voices of the marginalized, because there's so much wisdom there. For example, First Nations knowledge, much of it is oral knowledge, orally transmitted knowledge. And because it's orally transmitted, it's not seen as carrying as much weight and authority as textual knowledge and such. And yet a lot of that knowledge is incredibly pertinent and valuable. And in fact, I can't think of any more pertinent and valuable knowledge in this day and age of global warming and Anthropocene Earth than First Nations and Indigenous peoples' knowledges. It's really quite stark to me in terms of how glaring the wisdom is, and how glaring is the neglect of that wisdom. And then I think the other question would be, are memorials meant as a kind of tool to, do they serve as a kind of a role? Is it meant to serve as a kind of a role in some process of, I guess what I would call transitional justice? That is, it's a step, or it's a procedure in a sequence of procedures towards an outright full and honest accounting, right? And if we stop short of that, then the problem becomes that we fall back on the idea that monuments and certainly memorials should be honorific, it should be heroizing, and it should be emotionally soothing. Even if it brings up a kind of trauma, it shouldn't bring up the trauma in all its dimensions, but it should bring up the trauma as a kind of soothing, melancholic engendering of feelings. And that's the most common, I think, shortcoming of the program of monumentality today, memorialization today, which is that it doesn't take into account truth to power. It doesn't take into in its dimensions, because it can't. There's a lot of restrictions, even symbolic laws in place that says you cannot speak about certain things, such as challenging those in power, challenging the hegemonic rules of power and such. So that makes it very, very difficult. But I think the key is to always understand that the social landscape isn't just, and so before I get to that, and so what you get is these kinds of monuments where the narrative is very narrowly defined, and that it tries to be all things to all people. And it tries to, it looks upon the social landscape as somewhat undifferentiated, in fact, all right, and that the monument is meant to be born out of consensus, and that it is not invested in particular subsets of constituent interests and so on. But in fact, the social landscape is highly differentiated, and I think that's the first rule of we need to understand that it's not it's like, like in Western movies, right? The land was there to be conquered because it meant it was empty. But of course, Native people lived on that land for thousands of years. And not only is it differentiated, and I think memorials need to take some stock of that very fact. They don't do it by and large today, but also that the social landscape is also conflicted. And I think I prefer to kind of leave it at that kind of hanging note for my preamble. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Ken. That was amazing. It just, as a landscape architect, it just raises so many questions for me about what you're talking about. The monuments currently have a homogenizing effect on that public narrative, in the differentiation that you speak about. How does that sort of feed into often the public process that we're beholden, to take part in when creating these monuments, and current public process, just in design in general, which still relies on, sort of the democracy of numbers in terms of who gets the most votes for particular ways to approach narratives. Anyway, lots of questions there, but I thank you for that. I am pleased to next introduce Skundaal Bernie Williams. Skundaal is a power force. It's been a real honor to meet her in the past few weeks and speak with her. She's a Haida master carver, an artist, activist, longtime downtown East Side resident, and community builder. Skundaal is a passionate advocate and rallies against the discrimination, abuse, and sexual assault, human trafficking and exploitation against Aboriginal and Two-Spirit, LGBTQ+ women and girls. Skundaal is a co-founder of Walk for Justice, which brought national attention to the Highway of Tears and Vancouver's downtown East Side. And amazingly to me, they helped to accomplish this by walking across Canada 7 times, starting from East Vancouver to Ottawa, and walk the Highway of Tears 3 times. I learned this online, Skundaal. The momentum eventually assisted in the federal government's decision to create a national inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Skundaal's art studio, The Sacred Circle, has hosted numerous initiatives, including the Elders Gathering Place, a grassroots initiative helping elders meet their daily nutritional requirements, but also as a way to create community by facilitating an all nations drum circle, as well as other cultural activities. Skundaal is the first and only female apprentice of the master Haida carver, Bill Reid. Their carved poles can be seen at various locations in Vancouver, including poles at the First United Church, Van Tech Secondary School, and Pigeon Park in the downtown East Side. The survivor totem in Pigeon Park was created to remember and honor survivors of injustice and discrimination from multiple cultures. It symbolizes the downtown East Side community struggle for survival and inclusion, and we look forward to hearing more about this work today. Their artwork is renowned around the world in many international and national museums and collections. One of Skundaal's great works, a traditional Haida button blanket called Dance of the Eagle, was presented to the first Indigenous woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, Rigoberta Menchú, Tomb of Guatemala, in 1992. And I remember when that happened, I watched that on TV. I welcome you, Skundaal Bernie Roberts, and look forward to your words. Thank you.
I just want to say how I'm currently sitting outside in my vehicle where I do much of my work because I'm always on the go. This is part of my dad's territory, the Coast Salish territory of the Musqueam Tsleil-Waututh in Squamish. My name is Jaad, which means Golden Spruce Woman. I'm from a small village in the ocean, Haida Gwaii, that was currently called the Queen Charlotte Islands, and I'm very grateful to do this work here on this beautiful territory and that. And how for your kind words and that. And Ken, how to you too, and Joe. I Googled you guys, so I don't know much about you, but I Google you what I can, and I'm just really honored to be in such great presence with you about this work and that. Interesting enough, first I want to say to the grandmothers that are online, it was Elder Grace from our Japanese community. Through the Sacred Circle Society, it's ironic. I never looked at any of the work that I do as like after Monumental. I just go and carve, and that you never think about it. And it was through these elders, Elder Sid too, Elder Grace, Raj from the Kamagata Maru, and my education was very limited, knowing about the history, and I was very ignorant to this, and I have to say it, so learning through these great elders, Sid Tanak and Grace and them and Raj, like I said, and when the word came down, gentrification was a huge, huge word in that, and we were worrying about the park, and I was through also Mark Townsend back then from the Portland Hotel Society. He approached me one day and he said, Skundaal, I'm getting really, really worried about what's going to happen at the Pigeon Park and that. And I didn't want to carve any more poles in that because I've got his lung disease, so all chemicals that I'm around, I got to be very cautious of that. And I thought, okay, how are we going to do this? And I said, okay, one thing that we can do is, well, let's put a totem pole up there while everybody thought we were crazy. And but it was ironic, that word, changed it changed a lot of stuff down there. And with these elite, I hate to say this, but these are very privileged people that want to build. They want to. I remember when the old co-op radio used to be there, and it was a vibrant area for people to meet, and that was everyday living. And then when that, like I said, that word just really resonated and hit the downtown east side, gentrification. Then we find out about these big, corporate people that want to come in to build, to change the face of everything and that. And I thought, no, this is not going to happen. This is where the elders of the downtown east side came together, along with Margaret Mitchell, and before she had passed away, and Jenny Kwan. There's so many diverse, from this community. And the fear that was there, I was scared because I'm by myself. I'm fighting the city. I'm fighting against the Parks Board back then. It took us 5 years to get a yes, and even Hereditary Chief Bill Williams from the Squamish said to the Parks Board, with or without you, this poll is going up. We asked them, what is the fear? What was that fear? And one said, well, it's an eyesore. I've never known, something so beautiful that was created by 9 women, homeless women, to, create this masterpiece. I was only the humble servant to assist these women, and to have somebody say that, well, that just cut like a knife right there, because now we are brown women, and those doors shut on us. But how it shifted is when the elders came in. Then they took notice and, we're not messing around with, because we changed that and we called it as it is. We are in the faces of racism here. And I have to say that right out. I looked at them. This is exactly what, I'm looking at. you stay silent for so long in that, and because like you feel that nobody's they're not listening to you. And it was these elders that helped to shift this, because we all stood together to make that statement. When I looked at that word monumental is reckoning, like holy crap, that was it right there. And that's what it became about. The stories needed to be told, the truth. It's truth telling. And that's what it was. And I tell you, to see it today, those very people that, are, part of like the corporate realm there, have really softened it now, because they've seen something shift. Now, if it was just myself and those 9 brown women, nothing would have gotten done. We wouldn't have been able to move this. We would have still been fighting to put that pole up, because one of the things that we kept asking, what are you afraid of? What is it about this totem pole that's called the survivor's totem pole? Why does that instill that fear in you? What are you afraid of? Then we realize what it is. Well, we already knew. It's the truth telling about what has happened in our community that nobody wants to talk about, because everybody looks at it, well, it's Skid Row. Well, yeah, but there's history there. There's, Hogan's Alley. I have a table when I used to work in one of the seediest bars, because I'm a single mom. So I took a third job to raise my 3 kids, because I had a deadbeat ex-husband. And I found a table with Billie Holiday's, she signed this table that I still have. Learning about who she is, as one of the greatest, jazz and blues singers, but the history that she had with Hogan's Alley. Nobody wanted to talk about Hogan's Alley. Nobody wanted to talk about the Kamagata Maru. Really, nobody wanted to talk about the head tax or the history of our Japanese internment here. And this is what this pole symbolizes for us. And that was the biggest fear, and the racism around it, that nobody wanted to even talk about that neither. And so when this pole came up, I thought to myself, my Lord, we raised it, was a beautiful event. Then 2 non-native men decided, because of the word came out about Cassie Jack. This came from Victoria and Duncan. It hit over here that if that monument comes down in Gastown, that they were going to burn the totem poles down. I got a taste of it. Thank God for Jean Swanson that just got newly elected into city council. I phoned her and I said, 2 non-native guys took a bucket with one of those extender ones and that you can do the high windows. They dipped that, they tied this end with towels. They dipped it in paint thinner and put it right on top of the survivor's pole. We were ready. We didn't know how this was going to play out in that, and we're very saddened by the devastation of the other 3 totem poles up at Oppenheimer. But because of the group of elders that came together and the supporters around the elders from the community, this shifted again. The elders said, no, we had enough. We need to get the city on board and the parks board. This is what is happening. No more. So we refurbished the poles, and that's what's happened. But I think now they finally realize that we're not going anywhere, too soon, even with those threats that have been uttered out that if Cassie Jack comes down, they are going to retaliate. A lot of people don't want to talk about that. There is white supremacy that exists. It exists right here, and we have to deal with it. We have to deal with that, and we have to educate. This is what the Survivors Poll is about. It's about education. It's about teaching You know, we come from, yes, an oral history, but just because that something is not written down, it does not mean that our oral history is not truth. It is very truth. And this is what the survivor's pole is about. It has taught me, you know, on my little journey here about who I am, but, you know, this is land-based healing for all of us too. And this is, you know, why, you know, I create, you know, what I do. I use my art as well to educate and to tell the truth of who we are as not only Indigenous people, but as like a two-spirited person too, that we've kind of been left out. You know, I'm a gay woman, and that, you know, people, it's like out of sight, out of mind. And no, this is part of, this defines who I am. It's through my work and, you know, in the community and that. But I really respect, you know, what you said too, Ken. Wow, this is a huge word. And anyways, I'm just grateful to be here, and I look forward to the questions and that.
Thank you so much, Skundaal. That was really incredible. It raises a topic that I'm hoping we can talk about in the breakout sessions and collectively, is not just about the pole, which is powerful in its own right and has a presence and a power within it, but also the process and that process that you speak of, where you're working together interculturally across generations. I think that also is what inspires fear within these sort of bureaucratic and places of power, because they've worked so hard to segregate communities, segregate individuals. And so when they see that coming together to actually do something and to retake space in areas where people have been disenfranchised and removed from the land, and to actually put something there that marks that symbolically, I think that's also where the fear comes from. And I think, you know, in terms of whether we call it a monument or not, I agree it's a monumental act, and it's an act that demands reckoning. And I think it's very brave and it's very necessary. And it's you know, so I look forward to having further discussion with you on that. So I'll move on to Joe Fry. And Joe is the founding principal of HAPA Collaborative and a contemporary voice for landscape architecture and urban design in Vancouver. Throughout his career, Joe has dedicated himself to deepening the discussion around the economic, societal, and environmental values of civic placemaking. His work inspires attachments between people and their environments by revitalizing forgotten spaces into ones buzzing with social energy as dynamic and intricate parts of a larger connected whole. Over his 25 years as a landscape architect, Joe has explored a long and deep-seated interest in commemorative sites and the intersection between culture and tradition, community and ethnicity, private stories and public histories. The landscape is a powerful medium to reveal these themes, offering overlappings of meaning and ultimately a deeply personal connection to place. HAPA has worked on several monuments and memorials, including the Canadian Navy Monument in Ottawa, Yeefau Park in New Westminster, and of course, the Steveston Nikkei Internment Memorial, as well as various design competitions and conceptual works. Joe is a Sansei third-generation Japanese Canadian, a coach, a parent, a volunteer, and a committed participant in the collective discussion about civic design and public realm. I've known Joe for over 20 years as a former coworker, collaborator, co-presenter, and occasional competitor in landscape architecture. Over that time, I've gained a huge amount of respect for his work and process, and I'm so happy that he could join the conversation today. Please welcome Joe Fry.
Thanks, Kelty. Very humbled by the opportunity to talk with you and this group, and with Ken and Bernie. And very touched by Bernie's stories and the work that you've been able to accomplish in at the downtown east side, and not just with the totem pole, but with a lifetime of work. And a lot of the stories that you brought up, and Ken, that you've raised here, really given me some pause to reflect on what this opportunity of commemoration is. And Kelty and I have talked a lot about this for over 25 years of our practice, and starting with my first project at the University of Guelph, which was a commemoration of the Japanese Canadian internment, and I'll show you some of the progress on that. But we talk about truth telling, and I remember one of the quotations from that project and it was probably an old dead white guy that said it, but truth about truth. If you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. And I think the fundamentals of why it's important to consider the commemorative act of storytelling is specifically for that reason. It's the truth is often not told correctly, not told in its entirety, and not told from everyone's perspective. So I'm just going to share a few images here that I hope will help to, I always like hiding behind some images when I'm talking, but let me just start from the beginning here. And what I want to maybe with this project is bring some of the discussion points that Ken and Bernie had raised and focus it on a couple of examples of the work that we've done. And when Kelty mentioned we were competing for this project, but frankly, I think your input along the way, Kelty, was immensely valuable as well. But we were working on a project in Steveston. I live in Steveston on a traditional territory, the Musqueam. Fraser River is just beyond my screen here. Steveston has become home for me, and my wife grew up here. And this project became such an important beginning of a discussion with the Japanese Canadian community here that was one of the first to return to the BC coast after they were allowed to return because of their connection to the fishing industry and on the Fraser River. When we were approached, there was a hope to build a memorial, a monument, a bronze statue of a figure. They said, we think probably a woman and a child waiting for the train. The tram building is just to the bottom right of this image, which is how a lot of the Japanese families were evacuated from Steveston. And we challenged that whole idea of the traditional kind of statue by saying that we think this is an opportunity on this site to immerse, to create an experiential commemoration that allows people to walk through, that inspired in part by what Kelty showed with Myelin, to allow people to kind of be drawn into a place, to provoke a sense of curiosity that might not have been there previously or with any other type of commemoration, and to come away from that site having that curiosity satisfied. So we've made that pitch to the working group, and they agreed to consider it. We developed a series of pathways, which you can see connect across the site. It's about coming and going. It culminates in this large rock outcropping, which you'll see a detail of, but it also, the rock, the paving, and the planting all have some symbolic resonance. The plum tree in the middle actually fruits around the time in March, April 1949, when Japanese families were allowed to return to the coast, and they fruit, and that's the Japanese apricot that is the plum for umiboshi. So we've seen a few people actually picking these fruit later in the year. Sorry, that's when it flowers in March, April, and the fruit comes later in the year. But I think from my perspective, and I know Hanako's on the call here, she's in the middle top image. She was with our practice for a good 8-9 years, and was fundamentally important with, as Kelty mentioned, the process of arriving, this idea of doing our research, of digging in, of finding these stories, revealing these stories and trying to tell them in a as personal a way as we could. And it really started with her, Hanako, Lesia, Pengfei in our office, developing these questions, which we packaged in these bundles and gave to everyone to elicit a kind of, a response about what's important to you. And it was interesting to see how the responses, varied from the older generation to the younger generation, people like my kids who were just learning about their story. But it resulted in this really deep, we met with about 150 people, and it felt like a really deep process for us, and a revelatory process for us. What was really interesting, that was meeting with a craft group of women in their 70s, 80s, 90s. I believe there was one woman who's over 100 years old in this group, and they were making these baskets and coasters and placemats out of salmon can labels. And Ken Fisco actually produces these labels just for them. They're artifacts now. They're not commercially made anymore. These labels are given to them for them to weave into these baskets, and they would sell these baskets and placemats for like $2 each at craft fair. They didn't actually want to speak with us about the commemoration. They were quite reluctant to talk with us. But this little group in the back were making these beautiful woven patterns that were actually based, as Hanako found out later, on a paving pattern. Ishi datami ami means stone basket weave. Paving, tatami, it means paving. And we thought, what a nice way of creating a bit of a reference to a landscape in this act of commemoration. So when Ken talks about the oral tradition, I wonder about sort of the craft tradition and this kind of conversational or sort of knowledge that gets passed from generation to generation that isn't really even acknowledged in, the official transcripts of this history. And we were able to transmute that into a paving pattern. We worked with Ogawa landscape contractors and incredibly skilled stone mason to cut these, install these. This is Hanako's sketch on the left showing some variations on pattern. And I feel that this memorial helps to acknowledge something that had been kind of, not really openly discussed. There's always this, as many of you people on the call would say, there's a phrase from that era, shikataganai, meaning it cannot be helped. It is what it is. And I feel that this weaving, this act of weaving is really a protest. You can take all these things away and you can put us in these camps, but you cannot take away this idea of beauty and bringing a sense of domestic normalcy to people's lives in the worst of conditions. So we were still obliged to provide a bronze. Someone wanted a bronze piece, so we provided these little buttons and a map of all of the sites of the interment locations in the interior. Tashme, the road from Hope to Princeton was actually constructed by people like my grandfather. He worked up in Banff on the roads there, the road camps up there. But this was an important tactile gesture that we wanted people to be able to walk up and touch something. I'm going to talk briefly about the project I mentioned at the beginning with my work at a school, and I grew up in Marathon, right in the center of this image. It's Ojibwe of the Pic River First Nation, and right on the coast of Lake Superior. Nays Provincial Park was actually a site of a German POW camp during the war, and my parents were moved from Alexander Street to Nays, well, to Slocan, and then after 1945 from Slocan to Nays, and they found work in Geraldton, and that's where I was born. And Nays was this last place of community for a lot of Japanese people before they were, distributed to all of these different locations in Ontario and Quebec. And Nays, to me, was a site that I developed. These are all the drawings from 1994, showing some ideas or concepts around this point of dispersal in this field of jack pine that were planted over the site to actually hide the last vestiges of that camp. And there was also 20 kilometers from another camp that was used at Angler, which many of you might know of in the history text, is a place where there were Japanese citizens of Canadian descent who were interned at Angler as POWs. And the story, this is a project that is over 30 years. It's just really, I'm just, kicking it around in my head still. But I've come to this realization that this point of dispersal under the pine trees is this place where matsutake pine mushroom would grow. This is my grandmother collecting her haul here of probably hundreds of dollars of pine mushroom that when they went out into the bush, people would ask, when you're leaving? She'd say 7 o'clock, and she'd leave at 5 just to make sure no one followed her. These were secret gardens of the Northern Ontario. And this beautiful idea you can see in this kind of terrible image, but matsutake grow from one plant in these concentric rings out. So a plant that's 150 years old could be like several hundred feet in diameter. And I really want this to be the direction that we take this project. I'm still talking to the province and Bernie. The experience you're having with the park board is very similar to ours in terms of what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of telling the story about? And we're experiencing that now. But we're going to get it built. Need your help, I think. But this is a site that there are remnants of, and you can see the barbed wire from Angler. You walk into the bush and the barbed wire has been plowed under, and these jack pine have actually pushed the barbed wire up through the ground so you can still see it. And they're planted in rows upon jack pine and red pine with this amazing regimented pattern that, a simple gesture of a clearing in this forest, I think, would be the direction that we want to take. And I'll leave on a final note saying, my mom, who still lives in Marathon, has been working very hard with the province and the historic sites. So when we talk about commemoration, there's this kind of whose story is being told. So Nays is the site of a prisoner of war camp for German soldiers, and a very nicely encapsulated storytelling here. But I don't know if you can read this, but in the last sentence it says, these German soldiers were treated so humanely as military prisoners that they were, it prompted hundreds of them to immigrate to Canada after the war, as if Canada's treatment of these people was just so special. Not 20 kilometers from this site is the Angler prisoner of war camp, and no acknowledgement of the way that the same government at the same time were treating a group of 800 people quite differently. And that site has no recognition. There is no monument. There is no plaque. And we're going to be working the next several years to ensure that that story is told as well. So I hope maybe this is a few examples of how, Ken and Skundaal, your ideas around, like, to me, there's so many topics to touch, but for me, the act of commemoration is about truth. It's about transformation. It's transformation. It's about experience of body and mind, not just a storytelling or educational piece, but something that you physically have to experience. It's collaboration with all sorts of people, and it's really an acknowledgement of stories that probably wouldn't be told in other eras. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Joe. Every time you start crying, it's like somebody presses a button and I start crying. Thank you so much. All three presentations have been extremely moving. And I've got a lot of things going through my brain right now. And I think maybe we could start, the sort of stream that runs through all three presentations for me is this idea of, I don't want to say reclaiming space, because I don't think it's necessarily just about that, but this idea of mending relations and taking presence within space. Tricia Brown, Robertson, sorry, within the chat, she had made a comment, Joe, during your presentation around this idea of craft knowledge. And the way, the craft knowledge to me, which is expressed in both your work, Skundaal, and your work, Joe, and your work, Ken, which you didn't really share your work, but we all know your work, is this sort of tending to materiality, tending to form, but also the craft knowledge that's created through understanding material, but also connecting between people. So you talked about collaboration, Joe, but I think it was also reconnecting those ties that the government, and to speak specifically to Japanese Canadian experience and indeed to Indigenous experience, that the government has worked so hard to sever our connections and to create this sort of model minority that disappears into an invisibility within the larger landscape at best, right? If not to completely get rid of. And so, that sort of move to isolate, as they did with the internment camps, as they did with sending families out to sugar beet farms with residential schools, by segregating families, by sending men away, fathers away from their children, women away, and so-called, people who are breaking the law, who were protesting to prisoner of war camps. That sort of work that you guys are doing, which is so strong in terms of reconnecting and passing on those stories and the knowledge of carving, Skundaal, the fact that you work with people who haven't necessarily carved before, with your children, to pass on that knowledge and that deep relationship to the cedar, to form, to tell stories that are really important and that keep these connections alive for us between generations as well. Like that Shikata Ganai, as I've mentioned a few times now, really drives me nuts, because it's a way for people to just disregard that history and to not talk about it. And I know that's how many of our great grandparents and indeed parents, great and grandparents, were able to survive. But I think that the knowledge that we have now about intergenerational trauma, the empowerment and the incredible emotional experience that we have when we do these sorts of projects is testament to how important they are. So I guess that's a long way to introduce the question, but my first question, and then I would love it if you guys can, I know you have lots of questions for each other as well, is how does that sort of the relational quality of monument making, I'll just call it that, and I know that you don't all call your work monument, but how does that play into this idea of reckoning or monumental reckoning? And maybe I'll start with you, Ken.
Well, I have some comments in terms of just a preamble to your question. First of all, I think that, for any society such as we have in this in a political economy, which is very unevenly distributed in terms of whose voice is heard, whose voice is not heard, who has the power to speak and who has the right to speak and who does not have the right to speak, you're always going to have enforcements, right, in the form of a system of representation that enforces in a very hegemonic way and also very naturalized, right? So it seems naturalized way. These rules of what is uneven is not considered uneven. And so, because it's seen as part of nature. And so a threat to that is an alternative system of representation, right? Anytime you have an alternate system of representation that challenges the dominance of the dominant system of representation, then it needs to be eradicated, right? With violence, right? With residential schools, with internment, right? Because
with fire on to poles, right?
Right, but it's also, you know, it's obvious, and you know, at its heart, it's highly there's a psychopathic, because it's about insecurity. It's about people who are not whole. They're not complete unto themselves. They don't feel a part of nature. They don't feel like they feel like they're somehow sovereign from all the other contingencies that make up the world, which is also what makes the world really interesting. So that's my first, but I can't remember the last part of the question. In terms of how do monuments help facilitate
or the process, maybe the process of making monuments, or that idea of whether it's craft or tending or working with people or collaboration.
Right, and I guess I wanted to say that crafts is part of that system of representation, right? Because it's moreover, it's even more dangerous because it's a very embodying method of knowledge. It's not just the knowledge that you hand down by oral history, but it's through the experience itself in time and space over history. And so that sense of embodiment is always very, very dangerous, right? I mean, it can also be very strong, and I think any memorial should call up embodiment as a kind of salient issue. Obviously, with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial by Maya Lin, embodiment was key. The right people, not only embodiment in terms of the frottage, in terms of the rubbings on the wall, but embodiment in terms of the descent and then the reconciliation, so to speak, with the final ascent going back up to ground level.
That's right. I want to give some space to you. We just have 4 minutes. I just would love to hear from you, Skundaal, and then Joe as well. If whatever you want to talk about, you don't have to necessarily respond to that question. I didn't realize how short for time we were here. Thank you, Ken.
What was the question again?
Oh boy. Does anyone else want to reframe the question? I think it's about, well, so maybe just talk about, in response to what Ken was saying. I thought I saw your hand go up at a certain point where Ken was talking about that idea of craft, of relationship to material, of nature, relationship to nature, of the process of reconnection and relations, which is so powerful and so threatening to many people.
And what you're saying right there, it is very threatening, even when, going as far back as, to purchase this log that I got. It came directly from my homeland in Sandsbed, in Haida. But to get it, I had to purchase, and that came from our land. That should have been a gift, but I had to buy that. That was really, really difficult. That was the hardest part there. Then it made a journey home. It sat for 5 years to make sure that, and it had all the skin, everything still left on it, just to leave it for 5 years and then to let the salt, because it was towed over in the ocean from Haida to Vancouver, and then made its journey to North Vancouver to Squamish, to Capilano Reserve there, and then made its journey here to Vancouver in the downtown east side. But the power with that story, it humiliated that logging company, who are not in existence anymore. Just the shame of even talking about it. They wanted to do some little reconciliation with me on it, and I said, no, you cannot change something that is already done, that was physically witnessed on it. So they try to rectify that, but by that time, the matriarchs and the elders involved around that, had clearly said no. And just that, in itself, to make its journey, to make it to the downtown east side, to watch it inception of, like, you know, when it began to where it is today, the threat of, you know, at the end of this again, it really speaks volumes, you know, for me to look at, like, what a journey this log has come through. And, you know, the parallel with Indigenous people, our first people out here, especially with, like, the Japanese community, you know, our cultures are so parallel together. The stories are so much the same. And yeah, but we're still standing, you know, and that tree represents our resilience and strength in that with one another. And as long as we do this together, they can't touch us, you know, and I think that that's the real message, you know. Even when I was watching Joe's slide, what I seen right there was the elders again. The elders, you know, they are the backbone to, you know, who we are, you know, as that we define ourselves, you know, with what we're doing and how we create that too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Joe, I know we're just going to claim another few minutes here, if that's okay, just to give you some space. There's a number of really great questions in the chat, so I'm hoping that we can continue in the breakout rooms and talk about
I think Nicole had posed a question about layers of commemoration or memorialization. I choose commemoration for some reason. I don't know if that's what that means, but I think, you know, Skundaal's piece is a great example of how layering or, you know, parallels, because the stories are similar but they're different. They're all different, right? But there's certain, what's common amongst them all are issues of power and race, right? And I think finding those commonalities that you, as you did with the totem, but also the interpretation of these things afterwards. We heard very clearly from the committee in Steveston that they wanted this to be a multicultural story, particularly with everything that's happening today, and to just reinforce for, you know, again, my kids who are part Chinese, part 1/4 Japanese and 1/4 Caucasian, didn't really know this story. And, you know, I think it's in the curriculum in Richmond, but it was a new story for them, and it's a new story to their classmates. And so I want to make sure that we wanted to make sure that we were acknowledging that kind of layering in it, and to not co-opt the space. You know, I think that's a really important idea, is that we're not trying to gentrify, or I think the question is really, how does it change the nature of claiming that space, but to tread lightly and to allow for other voices to be heard.
Yeah, I think we are 217 here. Thank you, Joe. I think there's just so many layers to what people have been saying, and I think that there's really excellent questions here in terms of the life of the monument, you know, after it's made, extending beyond what is the life of that monument, and that might speak again to the idea of tending or tear down or decay. Somebody else had really wanted to talk about you know, the issues going on right now, and how do people feel about this idea of taking down monuments to historic power or to current power, and erasure of those monuments versus, as Ken called them, counter monuments. And there were other questions as well. So around gentrification, how can we ensure that the memorials that are created, or the memorialization spaces that are created, don't become another sort of gentrification that encourage that deterritorialization, or, you know, kicking people out of their homes in a literal sense. So I think now we are to move on to breakout rooms. And everybody will automatically be put into a breakout room. I understand some people need to leave early. But what we encourage in the breakout rooms is for everyone to make space for everybody's voices. I know this is an incredibly rich conversation and we all have a million thoughts in our minds, but I'm hoping that we can really focus on sharing as much, being present for maybe alternative viewpoints from that you may not agree with, and connecting as much as possible. So without further ado, I will look forward to seeing people in one chat.
Hi, everyone. I'm back as your housekeeper, just leading into the section where we share our questions that we've decided in our breakout rooms. So yeah, I will move on to our facilitators now, and they'll share questions from each of the groups.
Great. Thank you to my group, Nicole, Hanako, Janice, and Kirsten. So we had a great session generating a lot of questions. So I'm just choosing one at random as our representative. And what I'm choosing is, are all truths worth telling? What are the stakes of telling all truths?
Hi, everybody. I am sorry, I'm trying to get my questions together. Okay, so thanks to group 2. My group was Jinmi, Joe, and Laura, and okay, so how can monuments and commemoration help us think differently about time and temporality? How can these moments of memorialization further relationship making and heal those past traumas, and create moments of transformation? And how can commemorative acts be a form of memorial?
Hello. So we had a great conversation with Azumi and Trisha. A series of questions. One we landed on was, how can we be attuned to embodied knowledge and wisdoms from the ancestors so that we can carry them on through our own bodies and actions and pass them on to the next generations? And a shorter version of that is, how are we all walking memorials of our ancestors?
Hey, yeah, we also had a really fun conversation. It was me, Julie, Ken, and Savannah. And our question is, how do we create and maintain sites of nourishment for the community? And how do we memorialize these sites, specifically of previous exploitation, in ways that are not just renaming them, but reclaiming them in story, in practice, and in heritage?
Hi, everyone. I had a great group with Imogen, Vivian, Skundaal, and Carrie. We had a handful of great questions, and we landed on number 1, how do we connect monuments to the land around them? And as well as, what happens if there's conflict between varying voices in the context of creating and decision-making and planning monuments?
Hi, everyone. Credit and big gratitude to Emmy, Shauna, and Marco for being a part of our group. We landed on kind of a waterfall style question, which is a monument a worthwhile opportunity, or is it a threat? Are monuments always the answer? How can we go beyond statues and grand things to discover things less imposing, but I think ours also doubles as a poem now that I read it out loud.
Hello, everyone. I had an amazing group with Teresa, Kelty, Susan, and Judy. And our question that we came up with is, how can monuments take a different form? A play, a festival? And then a follow-up is, what have we done enough for the monuments that we have today?
Hi, I see my face. Am I supposed to be doing something? Am I to wrap up? Closing remarks. Well, I'm really overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness and the incredible questions that came out of this. It was a wonderful experience to be involved in the conversation today, and it's extremely moving. I participated in the last Powell Street Festival or Paueru Gai discussion number 8, and everyone was crying that one too. So thank you so much. It says announce date for the next panel event, but this is the actual final Paueru Gai dialogue. So again, thank you to the Powell Street Festival. Thank you to all of you who worked so hard behind the scenes to make this, not only this festival, this number 9 event happen, but all of them. I think it was an incredible format. I know there's other events, but as a sort of meaningful placeholder for the actual festival where we come together at Oppenheimer Park, I thought this was just amazing. So thank you so much. And I'm hoping to participate in at least some of the informal discussion that can happen after this. Thank you so much.